Good afternoon. Is everybody having a good time? We want to thank you all for your participation. Our topic for the closing panel is we want to move beyond the boundaries of Northeastern Ohio and North America to talk about international collaboration and how the technology becomes a tool. I want to come back to the way Wendy framed it for us earlier this morning. Our focus not on the tools, but what the tools let us do, how the technology may help to erase some of the boundaries and foster collaboration. Sort of the framing issue here is that the rapid development of network and mobile technologies really is transforming the dynamic collaboration and global participation. Many of us do email or we Skype, not just with friends and families, but with colleagues across the globe. We look for resources. We have access to libraries that go well beyond the physical boundaries of our individual campuses and our communities. So we really do want to provide an international perspective on this from 4 North Americans, right? That was a bad joke, at any rate, but at least take a North American perspective about what this really does. And again, come back to some of the questions we asked with the first panel. What tools really make a difference? What tools would we like to have? How do we get beyond the tools to really talk about issues of culture and collaboration? Very quickly, introductions. Christine Geith, my apologies, is with MSU, Michigan State University Global. The bios, again, are in the programs. Larry Johnson is with the New Media Consortium. Vijay Kumar is with MIT. I'll just take a moment. Vijay's got a very long and complex title, but I understand his new role is that he is the senior diffusionist at MIT, whatever that means. And Stuart Youngner is the bioethics, and here at Case Western Reserve University. He among the panel members, he is actually a white coat. He is an MD by training. I believe the rest of us have more academic, other kinds of stuff. I want to begin, Chris, by turning to you. So MSU is a global venture by title, which means you're exporting and importing. You're exporting, I'm assuming, courses, content, stuff. Mm-hmm. You're importing students from other areas beyond the Michigan and Northeastern, Midwestern area. What does it mean to be global in that context, in this environment? And what does that mean in terms of framing the resources and the infrastructure to be global?
Good question. Yeah, our group is called MSU Global. The long title is MSU Global Online Connection. And we do get involved in kind of the import and export of programs. So we think of those like packages, so credit programs, short courses, non-credit programs. They don't all have, they're not all online. Some of them are face-to-face, some of them are blended. But I think in the context of this meeting, and given all the presentations that I've been able to participate in today, I guess MSU is a global campus. We actually have, offices in Beijing. We have a campus in Dubai now where we have faculty and students at both locations. We have our student group is actually in Dubai now, becoming part of the student group at our big campus in Lansing, Michigan. But I think where we're really seeing collaboration and the tools used beyond this kind of program packaging and import and export is really for faculty collaboration. And what we found in our experience is a long-term relationship with a sister school. We have hundreds of MOUs with different institutions around the world. And the collaboration with faculty to faculty around their research and their students around their research then builds up into programs. And it's that type of collaboration that we're focusing more on in our strategy for international partnerships, is collaborating at the individual faculty level and not going in immediately with importing and exporting of packaged programs.
Vijay, what about infrastructure for that? MIT faculty do a lot of work with their colleagues beyond North America. What kind of an infrastructure, how does the demand on the infrastructure differ for folks who are involved in a lot of international activity as opposed to those who are just working cross-campus or different parts from one end of Cambridge to the other?
Well, infrastructure is a tricky word, and I mean, just to pick up from what Chris was saying, when you do individual collaborations, as many of these things start, it's easier because there are lots of things you can iron out, through some out-of-band agreements. It was just like the times that we all lived that preceded the internet. You could always have this person under your desk, fixing up the network, and you were ready to go. And so individual collaborations are easy because they don't make demands on the infrastructure. The only thing that you worry about is that the individual collaboration does not, pardon the vernacular, screw up the infrastructure for the rest of the campus. When it comes to, and then again, the other qualification that I'd make when we talk about infrastructure,
The international collaboration does not screw up the infrastructure for the rest of the campus?
Individual interaction,
Okay,
collaboration.
okay.
You know, that when you're serving the few, you don't screw up the many.
Okay.
That's the thing, you know. But infrastructure, you know, we jump to think about the technical infrastructure. And in some cases, technical problems are easy to solve. The infrastructure becomes complex when you think about institutional collaboration, because suddenly the whole baggage of, you know, institutional inertia, policies, and most of our intent comes into the way, you know, and because you're not clear about why you, after all the exuberance of signing the MOUs, and you know, you suddenly forgot why it is that you wanted to collaborate in the first place, you know. And I mean, and because then infrastructure starts kicking in, and you know, it's very interesting because you sort of think you want one thing, and then as you're proceeding, you know, you find out that, you know, that intent has sort of been subordinated. So technical infrastructure does get complex with institutional collaborations because you need a much higher degree of reliability, consistency, and then the overall infrastructure for engagement becomes difficult because, you know, you have things that hit up against your policies. Sometimes your policies about employment. If you're collaborating with another country, do they have the same hiring practices as you have? You know, and that's an aspect of the infrastructure that we don't think about.
Stuart, let me transition from Vijay's comments about MOUs and institutional agreements to the kind of the stuff that individual faculty members do. Some of it just emerges ad hoc. People meet at a meeting. When we had our conference call, you mentioned that you were among the thousands who were captive in Europe because of the volcano cloud. That individual collaboration often is unstructured, it's ad hoc, it works in real time. How does that sort of create new demands on the institutional infrastructure that you expect?
That's a big question. I think that we have a number of international research and education programs, short-term courses, and most of them have grown out of personal relationships, which then have grown into institutional relationships. And one of the things I'm very excited about the globalization at CASE is that there are opportunities when, and I think for me, but for other people who begin establishing relationships at universities, and they say, you know, we'd love to have more collaborations with your, because the collaboration, international collaboration is real big all over the world, it seems to me. People want to do it, is to be able to have the ability to come back here and say, look, here's a university that's interested, I have ties there, could we do something more? And that's been, I mean, that's the way ours have been more opportunistic things that we've taken advantage of on a personal level that have led to some institute, us being part of like an Erasmus Mundus program in Europe, an education program, but, well, I don't know if that answers your question.
Side of Vijay's question. Vijay said you don't want the institutional to get in the way of the individual. When are there instances on the other side where the individual gets in the way of the institutional?
Well,
or even that matters governmental.
This is the creative tension
world.
of life in an institution, I guess, in a way, that the individual get in the way of the institution. I guess it's as if the institution is trying to centralize, and people don't want to give up their individual control and power and creativity. And how you, I mean, you can see the tension on both sides of that, and I think it won't go away. It needs to be managed in the most constructive way that you can do it, I think.
Larry, let's turn this a little bit to some of the enabling technologies. So the Horizon Report essentially tries to preview for many of us who are either engaged in technology or as civilians and distill what's coming, what's emerging, what sort of cries out for attention. You've done now some of these, not just in the US, but you've also gone international with some of these things. How does the perspective of those technologies in that conversation change as you move from North America into other geographies?
Well, that's an interesting question because we've thought a lot about it. It's hard for me to conceptualize the Horizon Project without really thinking of it internationally. Our readership just passed 500,000 a year, and they come from more than 60 countries. So we know we have an international audience. By and large, the large group of technologies that are being looked at the list of 100, say, it's the same list everywhere. So people that are deeply engaged in educational technology, whether they're in Latin America, Asia, Australia, they're all looking at the same big list. Now, regionally, there are differences in the uptake that you can have. So, for example, in Australia, they're very limited by their national policies related to broadband. So any technology that requires a lot of broadband is not going to have a lot of uptake in Australia. It's too expensive for them. Likewise, in Latin America, they actually have better internet in Latin America than they do in Australia. They don't have that sort of issue, but they have the issue that the people there don't have a lot of devices. So the devices are not distributed. So anything that really implies people working remotely or at a distance is going to have less of an uptake. So that's how we see it. The challenges that people face, by and large, are the same situation as well. So we're all looking at generally the same big set of challenges. There are regional differences that are related mostly to policy.
Chris, let me turn this policy infrastructure back to MSU Global. Again, as a kind of an importer and an exporter of content, talent, students. Probably there's some money of that, but that may be the easy part. How do these issues play out in terms of the planning that you and your colleagues do?
Well, a lot has to do with scale. So if you're operating like Stuart on individual collaboration, that's there are certain issues inherent in that more smaller scale relationships. And it's when you decide to open a whole campus or offer a whole degree program internationally to more than just the 30 students that you can handle with your own faculty and instructional staff, that the issues of scale are where we're challenged. And that's where policy issues come in, and cost issues, and infrastructure issues. And again, they're all solvable. It's really, as Vijay said, these are all solvable technical issues to be aware of what the differences are, and then you go about problem solving and addressing it. But I think one of the things that we've learned in the process of doing a number of projects is the technology isn't just a tool for collaboration, it's a tool that you can bring to a relationship, to have a relationship around. So you can collaborate around things like open content. And I think that's where we've been finding some really fruitful ways of starting or enhancing or bringing an asset to the table around which we can collaborate. And that would be things like, instead of just thinking about it as exporting our program or recruiting international students to a master's in public health, for example, we're thinking about, what else can we offer when we want to strike up a partnership with faculty, research centers, and other institutions? What can we offer as an extension to that product that would really engender collaboration? So it's not like we're just teaching people, we are engaging them in intellectual conversation. We're looking for ways to do mutual research. We're engaging in projects together. And what we found is that using content assets, digital content resources, like the things you're doing today, the capturing of events, the capturing of research events, the telling of stories, the aggregation of research themes and papers from students and from faculty and from partners, we're finding that that's a fruitful way to collaborate with international partners, and not just us pushing out and exporting content at all, but really inviting collaboration around it. And I guess our newest sort of small scale right now venture there, if you go to a website called Latin America Learning, it's the very beginning of an open education resource repository that came out of an event kind of like this, all about issues of inequality in Latin America. And it's just the first step. It's the first small collection of assets that then we'll now use to reach out to partners that we already have and those that we want to create, using the content resources and the collection of attention as a resource around which we'll collaborate, and using all different kinds of tools.
Stuart, I want to come back to you. When we had our kind of a loose conversation conference call a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned that you don't think of yourself as a techie, but like many of us, you are dependent upon these even low, what we might call tier one technology tools, email, Skype, other resources for levels of collaboration. For many of us, again, it's how do we get to that next level, and what's missing even in the tier one tools?
Well, I have an iPhone. I love my iPhone. I have 18 applications. When I have dinner with people who have other iPhones, we sit and we share our applications. I'm sort of at that level. But one of the things that, in a way, it's not a dramatic, but a very important issue for me is that I do a lot of international work. I've helped develop programs, but I'm also a department chairman. And the days of being away for a week and not being in contact with my department are gone. It's very important to me to be in, being in touch allows me to be away. And I find it challenging, and I hear about things by, cost is one of the big things. And I hear about things by happenstance. I was in the Netherlands last year, and somebody said, you can do Skype on your iPhone. And, I spent a lot of time trying to do that. It doesn't work so well. But I'm thinking that it would be very useful for people like me, and I'm probably not the only one, to have a resource at CASE where, and maybe it would be classes or whatever, what's the latest communication technology? If you have an iPhone or a Droid and you're in other countries, what's the cheapest? Should you get a SIM card? Does a SIM card work? It's very practical stuff that's constantly changing and hard to keep up with. I do it randomly. I run into somebody at dinner, or like in the Netherlands, somebody you can do this. It would be very useful to have that as a central resource. And I think it would be, it seems like it would be doable.
It's a different part of it's kind of a user support infrastructure for those who are collaborating.
Absolutely.
Larry, you were just in a stage whisper said it's a great idea. Why?
I think it really gets at one of the real key barriers to people doing more of this, and that it's just they're not real sure how to do it. And in fact, we have a lot of tools these days that are easy to do. I'm a little bit further down the continuum than you are with I'm carrying 3 devices with me today, and that's actually
none of which will be
and a camera that weighs 11 pounds, but that's another story. But still, even my own self, sorting through those kinds of challenges is an ongoing sort of thing that I have to deal with, and that all of my staff have to deal with, and I suspect people everywhere are struggling with.
But is it different to do that with international colleagues than it is to do it with colleagues in, say, again, Vijay, from one end of Cambridge to another in North America?
Well, Stuart's point is actually very well taken, because one of the things that I think we have not done well, and not out of any malintent or because we forgot about it, is because the whole international engagement area is a relatively new beast. So our institutional infrastructures have not taken that requirement into account when we have designed our institutional infrastructures, all the way from what happens from just faculty and department chairs going out there to whole bunches of students. So we went through this connecting internet we did an experiment about 6 years ago, and perhaps you were there in India at that time, Casey, where we took extended internet all the way from CollabTech through MIT, through Singapore to Bombay to demonstrate it. And it took a lot of jumping through hoops, various vendors, and you suddenly realize that it's complex. So when you think about the challenges of the challenges of international engagement, not to sound like Yogi Berra, but it's challenging because it's hard.
I'm also wondering, is part of the difficulty is that we're taking civilian tools, consumer market tools in one sense, email, social networking devices which were not designed for collaborative work the way academics work, Skype, whatever it might be, and we're using them in ways that either push the boundaries or we're finding new applications. Chris? Is it a matter that we're just taking the stuff off the shelf, or do we need new things on the shelf?
Oh, do we need new tools?
Well, or do we just need new features? Do we need to extend the tools we have?
I think, in my opinion, there's so many tools we can't keep track of them, as Stuart was saying. But I think that's part of the adventure, is riding the wave of learning new things and figuring it out. Internationally, there's a couple lessons that we've learned regarding that technology. One is, for example, we had a collaborative group of faculty come from Mali, and they wanted to take part in our agriculture economics program, and we were thinking, what are all the different ways that their students can participate in our classes, using video conferencing, for example, but of course they don't have the infrastructure to do that. Or could they access our asynchronous courses in our learning management system, and of course they couldn't do that. And then we talked about, well, what kind of infrastructure do they have? And if we took ourselves back to 20 years ago, what we were doing, that's basically what they had. So we had to think and adjust, and adjusting technically was one thing, and it's hard, it's difficult because it's hard, it's a challenge because it's hard, but that was the least of the problems. What it really was if we did this differently, using technology solutions that we might have done on campus 20 years ago, is it as good a quality as what we do today using our current technology? It's so taken for granted, our set of tools, that we've kind of built up almost a cultural expectation of what quality is in online learning, for example, asynchronous online learning. And if you're using tools from 10, 15, 20 years ago, is that as good a quality? So that was a kind of an interesting lesson.
Well, let's quick poll on the panel. How much do the tools affect the quality? You're saying a lot, potentially.
Well, it's the perceived quality.
Perceived quality.
Yeah.
Larry?
Well, I do a very different sort of international collaboration than Chris does. In my sense, I mean, I use the telephone as much as any other tool, and that's, telephone and basic tools like wikis, and I use Skype sometimes, but we actually
Wiki
use...
wasn't a tool that was available 20 years ago. Skype was an extension of a kind of a telephone was. Do the tools make it better, or do they just give us more options? Vijay?
Well, it's a two-sided answer. Tools, if they are the central point of the collaboration, as Chris was identifying, have to be tools that address problems that they care about, your partner cares about. When it comes to engagement tools, I'll pick a page from your morning panel, from the early panel, because when you look at most of the countries that we deal with, the cloud and commodities. So they don't go for specialized tools. They look at the commodity internet, the public internet.
We're going to get to the cloud in a few moments, but yeah,
Right?
okay.
And then the other thing is they use commodity tools. It's Skype, cell phones, the stuff that they have access to, and you bring it at that level. And in fact, the other point that was made in the morning panel is one of the difficulties and the challenges that we have over here is that, we are at a competitive disadvantage because our technology infrastructures are really over-constrained. They're over-optimized, over-designed, whereas there it's all just simply available. Whether it is extremely high bandwidth in Korea, as the folks from Google were talking about this morning, or just simple cell phones and Skype, and there's a whole culture around commoditized technology.
What does that mean, Kumar?
Cell phones, simple stuff. People go to internet cafes. People pick, and when you talk about the,
So commodified means that
you can buy
anybody can have one.
Anybody can have it. That's
Okay.
right.
Simple, stripped down, and I think that was what we realized was we have many more bells and whistles that we think are part of the quality of what we do in a technology environment for teaching and learning that they don't have access to. So does it mean it's lesser quality? Like, should we think of it as going back in time, or do we really think of it as no? It's simple, it's streamlined, it's easy access to the cloud and commodity. In what ways does that?
And it works.
And it works,
Stuart,
yeah.
back to you.
And
You
it's
haven't-
low cost.
Yeah, you haven't spoken on this one. But the fact that the tools are perceived to be more sophisticated, do we get more quality out of that, or is it just essentially a matter of extending the analog of email and voice?
I think it can be both ways, but I love and I find useful a lot of the new stuff. Absolutely. I mean, you're going to talk about the cloud. I deal with the cloud on a very, very primitive level, which is my calendar. I have mobile, what is it called? Mobile Me. And so I have two secretaries who keep my calendar, and I keep my calendar. And they can make changes, and I can see it, and I can make theirs. We don't double. That to me has qualitatively improved things for me. It's not just a little bell and whistle, but the old way with my Palm, where I had to be there, and we'd sync it, and then wait around for 10 minutes while it was supposedly.
And that in and of itself, when you did it with a Palm, was a great leap forward.
Yeah.
At
And
the time.
when I got my first Palm,
Yeah.
my God, this is unbelievable.
Larry, how does the cloud change this? I mean, what is the impact of the cloud in this context? Or what could it be?
I hope you're not asking me that question.
No, Larry, you're safe. You opened it up. You brought us back to it.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that in just a second, because I think we're missing a very important point here when we're talking about the technology, because I think actually the biggest challenge that we face is around culture and around sensitivity to other cultures. And we just recently published the Horizon K-12 report with a photograph that we got off of Flickr that had some kids climbing on a rock, we thought, until I got the call from Australia that the rock was Uluru, and it's sacred to the Aboriginal Australians, and the notion of seeing a bunch of kids climbing on it was very offensive. You know, who knew? You know, and that's a very international collaboration that, you know, if you aren't sensitive to the culture, you're going to make mistakes like that. And the technology really wasn't a piece of it. Now, that said, without the cloud, we couldn't produce the Horizon Report. It's all done in the cloud. And you know, the ubiquity of those tools, the availability of people to come to things that persist in the cloud, make all sorts of things possible. But you know, I really have to underscore this notion of to be really successful at international collaboration involves a great deal of sensitivity.
I want to come back to the issue of culture as we move along, but I still want to push the thing about the cloud a little bit. So Chris, does the cloud make it then easier in some ways because it's not on my drive or it's not on my campus? And the fact that there are some providers who are, if you will, cross-global, the fact that there are these resources, Microsoft, Google, others, that reside in the cloud that are in theory available and ubiquitous, whether it's documents or if it's media.
I mean, I love it. It's enabling, it simplifies things. People can start new types of organizations ad hoc, like peer-to-peer university is a good example. There are other groups that are starting to do more peer things on the informal learning side, all empowered by the cloud technology. They don't have to have their own servers. They don't have to have their own IT staff, and so they can choose to, but they don't have to. They don't even have to pay for the infrastructure in many cases. They're free services that have different kinds of money. But when we have an institutional, beyond an individual collaboration, we have an institutional relationship, and it gets into talking about, you know, a larger scale collaboration. I think where we have to talk through this, but it just as part of the cultural sensitivity experience is just changing our mindset that the way we do things here, because it's easy and easy access, and we have a big IT department and a help desk and everything else, isn't necessarily the only way, isn't the best way, but we go in with our expectations of how we're used to working. And I think that's what gets questioned. You have to question everything you do in an international collaboration, from how you act and dress and, and eat and greet, all the way to, you know, how you really, what are your expectations and what's your intention, and what tools do you use. All those things get called into question. And I think in a very healthy and good way, that's one of the, it's not just a challenge, but it's a growth opportunity. And it really stretches everyone involved in different dimensions. So it's less, but it is less about the tool. I agree with Larry. It's really, it's part of your cultural expectation, and you don't realize what those are until you're in another context.
And the cloud brings us a new culture of collaboration in terms of those tools, and in that migration from controlling on my desktop to using tools on the cloud, does that then, you know, what does that do for the individual who is still the focus of that collaboration? Larry, let me...
Well, that's where regional concerns come in very powerfully. They're looking at Australia again. The notion of using the cloud to them is a source of great concern, because most of the cloud resides in North America, where the first place they go is the Patriot Act. Which nation's laws are going to apply to these data? What privacy provisions are being taken place? And it's resulted in a whole industry in Australia building private clouds, you know, to fill the gap. But when you're doing a project with Australia, you really need to understand that sensitivity, that they don't want to put their sensitive information, sensitive by their definition, on what they consider to be a cloud that is external to their
we see this
laws.
in, you know, the Google situation in China. Different cultures have different laws. What are the operating tools in different geographies?
Well, and expectations too.
Stuart, has this played out in some of your work with colleagues in different geographies?
Well, the most striking example is I spent a lot of time in Cuba. And it's
where it would absolutely play out.
It's worse than China. I mean, number one, they don't have much, and if you have it, they watch how you. I mean, so there, these kinds of, and I haven't been there for a few years, but I would guess it hasn't changed that much. Most people don't have it, and if you want to collaborate there, they're not going to let anybody in a cloud that's not, you know, being watched very carefully in Cuba. So that was a very dramatic thing. And also the technological, I mean, when I first went to Cuba, the only way I could communicate with the United States, this was '92, was to go to a hotel and pay $4 an hour on a telephone there. And they had a place where you could go. So it does depend a lot on where you're going and where you can collaborate. And one of the most interesting things to me is finding out there are places that are much more advanced than we are.
And Vijay, given some of the collaborative stuff that you're doing on behalf of MIT as the senior diffusionist, I'm thinking particularly Chris's comments and Larry's comments about cloud being based in North America, some of the work in Singapore, India, how does that begin to play out?
I mean, I like the way you're phrasing that question, because picking up from what Larry also was saying about regional influences, or differentiators. I'm thinking about this book called The Cloud and Culture, but Singapore, it's very interesting. Singapore has a very highly developed infrastructure, at least the internet infrastructure, the technical infrastructure is very highly developed. Not so, let's say, in India, right? And I mean, all the reasons notwithstanding, scale, size, a gazillion people, and so on. The thing is, in places like India, we note, unlike places in Singapore, that there is a greater tendency to rely on the cloud for a whole bunch of services because they have not developed institutional infrastructures and services on their infrastructure with the kind of robustness, let's say, US institutions have done or Singaporean institutions have done. So we are working with a couple of institutions. One of the most exciting things I'm doing, there's this Indian Institute for Human Settlements, where every time we talk about a service, immediately they want to know how to leverage the commodity internet to provide that service, whether it is a calendaring service or a translation service. And so I think it is regional, and I think I've seen this with some of our European partners also. The idea of developing the institute city is not a very popular idea in other countries, And we develop, whether it's places like Case, which is a big university, or UMass, which is a big university, you develop a whole city's infrastructure for the university. Whereas that's not the tendency in either smaller countries like, in Europe, or in places like India, which are sort of later in that technology spread. So I think the tendency to use the cloud and leverage the cloud, and in fact start almost leapfrog the institutional development of infrastructure to start really thinking about cloud services is a good tendency and perhaps a right way to think about it.
Okay. So in the other comments before?
I was going to follow up on what you said. Do you think that gives institutions who are organizations that are thinking cloud first as opposed to cloud second or cloud at all, does that give them, are they more nimble? Are they more flexible? I mean, are there any kinds of, what benefits accrue with that change, or not change, but with that mindset compared to more of an institution-centric, already developed mindset? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that they would, but it's a non-trivial question, because when you think about designing with the cloud in mind, it's a whole different thing, because suddenly you want to be able to interface, integrate, and manage services which you do not spawn, foster. They are there. So you think differently about the architecture of how you develop services, because you have to take a whole bunch of stuff that other people are developing. And also, I mean, notwithstanding all the policy questions that Larry was raising, you're also thinking about mixing and matching things to your advantage that you had no say in the development of.
We're back to the question of legacy systems and legacy users that we started with a little bit this morning. I want to push a little bit, Larry.
Well, there's one more dimension of this, and I'm sure the same is true in India, but I know the number for Australia. There are only 13 bundles of fiber that go into Australia. I mean, you literally can count on your fingers and toes all of the connections they have to the entire world. There's just 13, and you think about just the demand of the things that have to go through those pipes. They have to be thinking about local clouds, because if they really want to commoditize it, it's not going to handle the traffic.
I cannot resist. This is such an interesting comment, because I'm going to say that India probably has the largest amount of buried dark fiber in the world. Dark. Mm-hmm. Because lighting up the fire requires a whole bunch of institutional arrangements, people to be different than they are, in order to, and which is why people are not developing institutional infrastructures. One of the things that happened after I was involved with the National Knowledge Commission, as you know, and one of the outcomes of the National Knowledge Commission's recommendations was actually to create this National Knowledge Network, because the case that we made is that all these dreams about online education and scaling through open resources, is going to be suboptimally realized if you don't have a very, very robust high bandwidth network. So they have, for starters, connected up 1,500 institutions with 2.5 gigabit connectivity, right? And the way it was done was, or it's being done, is by coaxing a lot of the private providers to light up the dark fiber that's buried over there. So it's
Stuart, last chance before we move on.
Well, I want to come back to something I said earlier as I'm listening to this, because I'm probably the least technologically sophisticated person here, and I'm just wondering of you from other institutions. I mean, at medical schools and places like that, people who are at my level of management frequently are given special courses on business techniques, management, accounting, things that make them better managers. I'm not aware of anything that exists that keeps us up to date and educates us about the advance of technology that could affect and improve what we do and how we do it.
So you want something IT management for you and your counterparts?
Well, does that happen at other places? You know, that if I wanted to go once a month to a seminar where I'd be
Chris is,
some of
is
these terms.
designing one, and she'll sell it to you next month through MSU Global.
We'll export it from Michigan to Ohio.
Yeah.
So are you developing something like that?
No, but thanks for the idea. That's a
But
great idea.
next month she will have one,
I think
and she will compete against Vijay.
No,
Who will
but-
compete
No.
on price
Well-
and reputation.
No, we're going to collaborate and make it open, right, Vijay?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But no, I was thinking, I mean, that's such a wonderful idea, because I was thinking about Howard's lunchtime presentation when he was doing the whole social network thing. And in his course, in that whole thing, there's a whole scaffolding piece for people who might want to pick up on how to use social media for teaching. And you know, there's a whole bunch of
I think for
primers.
many of us, you've raised the point, for many of us in various contexts, Stuart, so much of this as, I don't want to say aging professionals, but established professionals, we get it by osmosis. And either the assumption is nobody will come if it's offered, because that's often the experience at universities. We'll offer the course, nobody shows up. They don't want it, or they're going to delegate it to somebody else. I think what we've seen in medical schools in terms of medical professionals getting management training is kind of an outlier compared to what we see in other parts, but less so. I need to move us on to some other parts of the conversation about culture for the moment. We've talked a little bit about the role of government in some of this. We've talked a bit about infrastructure, whether it's too much lots of dark fiber in India or not enough fiber in Australia as opposite extremes. What are some of the other cultural aspects that play into this conversation about collaboration that we need to address, that either the technology impedes or the technology facilitates? It's a 10-point question. Don't jump. Stuart, 10 points.
Just a real quick one. I mean, the idea, this is just at a very primitive level, how Americans send emails without hello or yours truly. You just send them. And in other countries, they don't do that. Mm-hmm. And you know how one of the problems with email is you can interpret things without the kind of visual feedback that you get. And that can be really interesting. Or they're not used to responding 10 minutes after you send it, and then you get a little irritated that they're not getting back to you, and if you're expecting it, they think you're crazy. So those are just very minute things, but I've run into that.
But they play into this because these are individual collaborations in terms of building collegial relationships that could lead to institutional relationships. Those are signals, Larry?
Well, I mean, a really obvious one is time zones. Yeah, you want to work with Australia, you're going to be doing it in the early evening here. You want to work with Europe, you're going to be doing it in the morning. You want to work with India, you're going to be up at midnight. And, I mean, you have to make concessions. I think the technology impedes, to come back directly to your question, in a lot of ways as it relates to culture, because we're so used to doing things the way that we do them. We're very quick, we're very fast, just as Stuart has noted. And those shortcuts don't always serve us well when we're really trying to reach out and embrace other cultures.
One of the best technologies we can invest in is probably more travel funds.
I'm sorry,
more travel funds, that kind of technology.
It's still a matter of the face-to-face and the person-to-person,
Well,
is what you're saying.
Well, in my own experience working in a new project in Africa, we didn't build in enough travel funds up front to really establish new relationships as strongly as we really realized later we needed to. And the technology like Skype, we have Skype calls all the time, whether people are in their office or they're on their cell phone. We can all do a conference that way. And email, of course. Those technologies really easily support transactions, transactional communication.
But they don't build trust.
It's difficult to build trust if it's not already there. So, well, I guess the difference is kind of hearkening back to what Joe Lambert said on the opening panel about storytelling. It's about listening. And if you're in transaction mode, you're giving yourselves enough opportunity to build a relationship around co-listening, right? Really listening for what's valuable to people, what's really meaningful, where's the emotional piece, what are they really about? So, one of my takeaways from that experience is we finally did get around to that, but we should have planned better and had more travel budget up front to really make sure that was solid before we moved into transaction mode. And there are ways to mitigate that, is to make sure you're arranging your phone calls, for example, in a way that we do like a check-in first. You don't get just right to the agenda. So it kind of gets to what Stuart was saying. So I think it's all about communication skills, regardless of the tools used, regardless of technology. And it's the listening piece, I think, that at least in the culture, our American culture, we don't listen enough. We don't slow down enough to really listen, regardless of whether it's face-to-face or person helps face-to-face, though.
Are there other aspects of culture? Vijay?
Yeah. So you notice I'm nodding my head this way just to say, yes, this is how we do it in India. I mean, there's that listening. The one thing about culture is it's not binary. It's not, you switch on and switch it off. It does, not to wax philosophical, takes time, takes a lot of listening, as you're saying. In our things, we noticed that as it is, let's say we were just in North America, dealing between two institutions itself, our institutional cultures, are so different, right? When you take it to an international level, so suddenly it's got multiple dimensions. You're not just dealing with another institution, you're dealing with another institution and another country and all the trappings that go with it, multiple languages, multiple tendencies, regional distrust that they have amongst themselves. And you are there trying to, and I think it's very humbling. First of all, the caution is that you don't go and start addressing that, because we don't even know those problems to address that. And sometimes we put on our very well-intended sense of being an ambassador of goodwill between themselves, and trying to get into problems that we don't get into. But there's the level of complexity, because when you're dealing with an international institution, you have all the, I shouldn't say baggage, but you have all the nuanced culture of that institution, plus all the stuff that comes from the fact that there is no one culture in many of these institutions that we deal with. You have multiple cultures represented by multiple parts of the country. So it does become very, very tricky. The translation piece, and you asked about technology that helps with culture. There is, it's funny. We have this wonderful application which allows you to go search video segments, digitized video segments, and so that you can quickly hone in onto a particular topic or be able to take the topic and extend it across different courses. And we had that, we were showcasing it to demonstrate how you can use open education resources. The part that they picked up on, this is in India, was the fact that the application that we had created allowed them to transcribe video and immediately translate it into multiple languages. So it's funny, that was not our intent at all, but suddenly they saw it. That became the key benefit, and because they saw it as a vehicle to address a lot of what they thought might be cultural barriers in the kinds of institutions that they were going to create.
So in a moment of shameless self-promotion, a number of people came up to me after the morning panel and said, gee, that was great. The moderation was really nicely done. The panel was great. And then somebody took me aside and said, yeah, but I was waiting for you to ask the hard question. You didn't ask anybody a hard question this morning. So I'm going to turn this back to the four of you. What hard question have we missed in this conversation that we should be asking about international collaboration and how the technology either currently impedes or facilitates, or where we want it to go? Larry, 10 points, you're first out.
I will jump in. I think that the hard question is, why should we do this at all? And the answer for me is almost immediate. The reason why we need to be doing it is because there is as much, if not more, good work happening outside of North America. Actually, there's clearly a lot more good work happening because there's just more of it. around the world. And if we truly want to be world class, we have to be engaged with these
wait a
people.
second. I'm going to take a contrarian view on that. You know, there was a time, and we talked about this in our conference call ahead of time, that for a PhD you had to be conversant in 2 languages because the stuff was all there. You know, whether you can argue whether English should be the lingua franca or not, but at least in the world of the internet that has arrived since the Netscape revolution that Tom Friedman talks about, that stuff is there. So you know, does that undermine your argument, or is that just push that aside? It really is irrelevant.
The accomplishment of my argument. It makes it easier to connect with those people. It makes it easier to learn about what they're doing. But at the end of the day, really to maximize the returns on that time, I think it really does lead to conversations, collaborations, interaction.
Stuart, what's the hard question we have missed? Haven't missed a hard question?
Not one that I'm aware of.
Okay, caveat, right? All right. Vijay, what's the hard question we've missed?
Well, now that Larry has said it, we haven't missed it. But you know, that was the big question, and it's a non-trivial question again. Why should we do it? And there are, you know, the educational answer which I see in spades at MIT is it just gives students some fantastic experiences. It brings in the other perspective, and also it affords them opportunities that we're just not able to do. They solve some real problems. There are kids who go and they're designing ambulances, rickshaw-based ambulances, right? And which are solving some complex engineering problems, because it's not just a matter of stringing 4 wheels and pulling somebody. You have to think about dampening and so on, go rough terrain. So it's really giving them some complex problem solving, relevant problem solving, giving the other perspective. As a guy who used to help run IT and also our media services at MIT some years ago, I think and I was watching how we developed our distance education infrastructure, our interactive telecommunication infrastructure. So we were able to prototype some large infrastructure transformations in a controlled manner because of some international collaborations. And when I think about it, we wouldn't have done it otherwise. We had this thing going with Singapore. So we said, look, what we want to do with Singapore is what we know how to do well, which is largely face-to-face education. And if you've got to do face-to-face education over a distance, we've got to ride on internet too, even if it's on a beta. And we've got to make sure that the infrastructure within the network, the rooms, the different kinds of classrooms, some wonderful innovative stuff, you know, and how can you annotate, collaborate, all that stuff. So we were able to do that because there was this focusing function of an international collaboration. So I really think it allows us to build out our infrastructure in interesting ways which you wouldn't consider otherwise.
Chris, yours is the last voice.
The last
What's
voice.
the hard question we have missed?
How can we do it better? How could we?
And what's the answer to that?
Well, I think we have to change our perspective a little bit. It's not about exporting or us. It's as much about us helping as it is us learning, and maybe even more. Us learning, going out into the world and asking, how can we help? How can we co-create? What can we learn from it? And I think the hardest thing is not assuming that we're in the position of power, not assuming that we're in the better and going out and helping. And it's a hard question because it's so subtle in changing your perspective. And until you're actually collaborating with colleagues and friends or family in another setting that's not Western, it's really, until you experience it, it's really hard to understand that difference in perspective. But that's why I think it's the harder question.
You have that experience each time you come from Michigan to Ohio, is that right? Bad joke. All right, I'm going to take your notion of going out into the world, because we're going to go out into the audience. And whoever this is the opportunity for the audience to have at the experts, if you will, going out into the world. So we've got a couple of questions. Mics are in motion.
So thanks for some terrific comments and insights. So I want to put a kind of irony on the table and ask for some quick reactions if you have any. So for the last 35 years as we've known the internet in an interesting way, it's been a kind of hegemony of the English language that has pervaded the development of the internet and all of the addressing schemes that actually make it possible for us to enjoy the internet technology, the internet education, economy, and the like. ICANN, which is the international organization responsible for all of these as it were, back office infrastructure that makes it possible has been under tremendous pressure for the last decade to somehow deal with this form of hegemony of the English language. And over the last 5 years or so has basically conceded that the next generation, which we're now, I don't mean next generation of people, I mean internet time, as in right now, is being redesigned to actually privilege many different languages and the actual architecture of the internet to actually support so that it doesn't necessarily all home to essentially a Western organized infrastructure. So the interesting thing, the irony is that on the one hand, we've been able to enjoy all this international collaboration in part because we actually have a lingua franca on the internet. And it strikes me that for the next 25 years, we may find ourselves in a fairly anarchic situation because we're going to have just a lot of likely and probable local and regional activity to grab back some of the control of the linguistic traditions. The whole networking schema, the .ins of the world will have within them all kinds of subdirectories. It won't just be an India direction, but within India, you're going to have all kinds of other ways of creating conversation. So I guess the question, a long way of getting there, is whether or not, in fact, we may be entering into a period of hiatus when it comes to collaboration, in part because the rest of the world is going to want to assert its identities and its sort of position of authority, or trying to reclaim authority that it's not had for these last 35 years. And I thought I would ask it to Vijay to start with, or Larry.
Larry?
That is an excellent question, and it's something that has struck me quite powerfully in our work from the Horizon Project, that there is absolutely a trend. For example, I was just in Mexico working with the Latin Americans, and in Mexico, there's a great desire to have everything be .mx. They're not really interested in what's in the rest of the world. The first thing they want to see is their stuff. And in one way, I celebrate that, and I say, wow, that's really cool. They've got a whole national identity emerging around what they can do with the internet. But it also means that if we don't have linguistic tools, we miss out on that part of the internet. The good news is now they're emerging. I mean, Google Translate is actually quite phenomenal, I think.
I think there's another dimension about this. I'm thinking of a story I heard recently that if you change your base country in a Google search, you get very different results. If you want to follow a news item, and if you are in the US as opposed to .fr or .mx or .br, whatever that story is, because it's going to start with local media, you can get very different perspectives on what on an event.
Should be required reading.
Yeah.
It really should.
Isn't that great?
Isn't that great? But that's also largely unknown in many ways. Stuart?
So you asked the hard question that I wanted to ask, but I didn't think of it.
Who was the you? Chris?
You.
Oh, I get credit for that one. Okay.
And that is, one of the things that I found is that the technology and the internet, which has been English, and the fact that English is the dominant language, the EU, if it has group activities, they have to be in English, has made the initial approach and communication very easy.
For us.
For us. Well, and for those of them who can do it.
For many of them, yeah.
But ultimately, when you get into the country, depending on what you're doing, if you want to go deeper, it becomes a problem. So it gets you in easy, but then you run into the barrier. And the story, what do you call somebody who can speak 2 languages, bilingual, 3 languages, trilingual, 1 language, American? And I'm guilty of that, and I think that's a big challenge for this country that I don't think it's taking too seriously, not just for national security, but because the depth of these things, and obviously we can't all learn 20 languages, but this international work does run into a barrier at some level where you're limited to dealing with people who can speak English, and that limits you tremendously. I'm sure it limits you in terms of their acceptance of you as on a psychological level as well, but I think that is a tremendous barrier, and you brought it up, and it's there now, and maybe it'll get worse. I don't know.
You looked like you wanted to jump in on this, and then I want to get to the audience so you get 1 or 2 questions, because I'm getting signaled that I've got very little time left. Okay. Another question from the audience? Question from Second Life. No. I blew the people from Second Life away because we pressed it on authenticity this morning, right? Question from the audience.
Yeah, I have a question here.
What?
And it was touched upon a little bit. And I work with museums internationally a bit. Academic exchanges, whether you're talking about Fulbright or other programs, have always had an air of academic diplomacy. In my field, we call it cultural diplomacy, and I guess academic diplomacy and cultural diplomacy are very much the same. And I was wondering whether in your collaborations, that ever rises to your thoughts at all, that this is in many ways a cultural diplomatic effort. And much in the same way the question was raised about tools to let you know what the latest, greatest gadgets might be. Are there tools out there to prepare you for these cultural differences, as many international businesses have? Does it exist in academia?
Anyone? Quick response? Quick response.
Quick response is yes, we do view it as a very important facet or vehicle for cultural diplomacy. In fact, when I look at when MIT launched OpenCourseware, one of the things that it characterized it was intellectual philanthropy in the international world. And when you look at it, it is the biggest currency that we have to both engage and understand other cultures just by virtue of the contact it has created with other cultures. So yes, are there tools that help you to do that better? I'm not sure. I cannot think of any other tool other than experience that helps you really understand this, engagement and experience, that facilitates that kind of cultural understanding better.
All right.
Another learning product opportunity, Len. Thank you.
All right. So Chris is leaving with a business plan. Vijay's leaving with a collaborator that's exporting stuff. Larry's got a pitch on the horizon, and Stuart's going to have a couple of centers built based on, has been the catalyst for some of these things. The panel's had a good time. We hope the rest of you have as well. My thanks to the panel, Stuart, Vijay, Larry, and Chris for your participation and this conversation among North Americans about going global. A little irony. I turn this back to Wendy. Wendy, it's all yours.
Well, thank you all. Terrific. What a day. What a day. We made it. Yes. Great. I want to thank the panelists in the afternoon, the panelists from the morning, all of the speakers that made today incredible. What interesting, meaningful conversations have occurred. I hope that you've been able to connect and collaborate with some people that you never knew before, and maybe we can extend this out further. I know that while I was standing in the hallway, Lev was gracious enough to come up and say, okay, Wendy, you can do it again next year. So get ready.